So Trilogy also have an industrial property trust,
Yes.
which has a focus on industrial assets around Australia. Just give me an idea of what your views are, Phil, in the industrial asset space within Australia itself.
Yeah, well, look, if you look at the industrial sector and you look at what's happened over the last 3 years, it's a sector which really went from being the ugly duckling to something which is quite attractive. And it's interesting because if you look at areas which haven't really been impacted by COVID, industrial property is one. The obvious things are you haven't had tenants asking for rent relief like you have in retail. And also, if you look at incentives, you don't have the same degree of incentives being paid as you do in offices. So if you look at the portfolio, it's usually pretty simple. You've got one tenant, and they're paying rent, and their rent is increasing either in line with inflation or at a minimum amount. So it actually provides some type of inflation hedge as well. The big issue I've had with industrial is people overpaying for assets, and you're seeing cap rates, particularly in capital cities, really declining. You know, I've seen instances where people have been paying cap rates at around 4.5%, which is extraordinarily low, particularly when you see interest rates starting to rise.
Yeah.
So we've taken the approach of really trying to present quite a diversified portfolio and trying to buy as well as what we could in terms of buying assets which have good lease covenants to well-known named tenants in areas that we like in terms of logistics, warehousing, mining, manufacturing, etc. And on good lease terms, and buying it well. And that's meant that to a large degree we've had to concentrate more on regional style areas because that's where you get the better return. Now we have been able to balance that with some exposure obviously to capital cities, but we've been very wary about paying too much for assets. Now what has meant as a result of that, of course, is that we've seen the underlying unit price of the Industrial Property Trust rising quite consistently over that period of time. And of course it does yield well in its current sense, but that yield will likely decrease as the unit price goes up, which sort of is a bit counterintuitive when you've got a rising interest rate environment. But look, I got to say, it's a nice portfolio. It is benefiting from increased valuations currently. Valuers at some point will have to take into account higher interest rates, and so those cap rates I don't think will be increasing forever. But currently it is still a very attractive area, and we're still aggressively looking at opportunities in that area. But I've got to say, you know, it's like finding diamonds in a mine.
Yes.
So, you know, you've got to search high and low to find the right property. Interestingly, there's a few properties which we're looking at right now, which I think are quite attractive.
And the other point that we've already done with some of the existing industrial assets that we have within the trust is that we provided value add type additional expansion.
Yep.
So that's part of the whole process as well, Phil.
Oh, sure. Look, when you look at an opportunity, you don't just look at the tenant and what they're paying and all. You got to look at the site coverage. You got to look at potential. And in those particular instances where we've been able to value add, it's generally been because the tenant wants to expand. And you touch on an interesting point there, and that is that offices are generally, fairly common. An office is an office. It might be at a different location, etc. But it doesn't take much for one tenant in an office to move to another building. With industrial property, it is harder because usually what you do as a landlord is that you try and make it attractive as possible for that tenant, and each tenant has their wishes, etc. You tend to find it's a bit more bespoke, and as a result of that, you tend to find, I think, that the tenant becomes more sticky as a result, particularly if you can provide value-added services to that particular tenant.